All right, well, unless folks think we should wait a little longer, I do want to make sure that Anders has the full time, and I think people will jump on the Zoom call in just a minute or two. So I'll go ahead with a brief introduction, and then we'll let Anders enlighten us on his work. So a little background: we are delighted to have Anders speak as our first speaker in the speaker series for the semester. His research interests broadly concern the interface of socio-political processes and environmental change, particularly relating to natural resource conflicts around protected areas. He was at the North Carolina State University for his BA. And Stockholm University for a master's as part of the Swedish International Development Agency grant, and worked in the Georgian Caucasus, where he investigated access, rights, and resource conflicts in the national park there. He worked in Malawi for MUD Africa, a Swedish NGO advocating for land and women's rights. And after Malawi, he moved back to the US, where he worked as a research associate at Purdue for 2 years, leading a research project that sought insight into the human dimensions of whooping crane conservation in Indiana. And we are very fortunate to have him teaching here at App State. So without further ado, we will pass the mic over to Anders. Thank you so much for joining us.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. Thank you for that introduction. It's a privilege to be here. Thank you all for inviting me. I found parking today, so I consider that no small victory. I'm just going to share my screen. There. Is that visible to everybody? Awesome. Well, today I'm going to be talking about research I did, as you mentioned, Kara, while I was at Stockholm University, from a grant from the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, which is kind of the Swedish equivalent of USAID. I did this research in 2016, and I spent about 5 months in Georgia, about 11 weeks of which were kind of active interviews and field work. Excuse my gimmicky title, I can't seem to shake alliterative titles, but hopefully I will do justice here today, despite it having been a while. So I'm not going to solely focus on my research in Georgia, but kind of trace some kind of broader implications from the research that I did there. First, the basic structure. I guess I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of protected areas and kind of prevailing criticisms of them, and then the theory that guided my research before giving kind of an overview of my research that I did in Georgia. I'll probably call it the park from now on, because Borjomi-Kharagauli National Park is a bit of a mouthful. And then at the end, I will talk about some takeaways or implications of that research. I think that perhaps it's best if we wait till the end for questions, if that's okay. If you have an urgent one, you're more than welcome to ask them. All right, so kind of the story of conservation starts, as we all know, in the United States, in the Western United States. Kind of the early conflicts between native people and extractive industries. It was mostly between kind of gold miners and loggers in the area of what is today Yosemite and Yellowstone, which were the two first national parks in the United States. There was kind of an early interest during that time, a growing interest to develop these parks and protect them, to kind of develop protected areas as they're known today. John Weir was kind of one of the early pioneers of this idea. Ironically, he kind of insisted that we protect these areas using narratives of wilderness and kind of pristine nature, despite knowing that these lands have long been used, managed, and cultivated by native people. So from kind of the first, from the development of the Yellowstone National Park in 1872 and then Yosemite thereafter, there was kind of a series of evictions and expulsions that kind of carried through the next 50 years, especially accelerating after the Park Service was developed in 1914. So this kind of set a precedent for conservation in the world, and this idea of a protected area as kind of a tool of conservation was spread internationally, first in Canada and then in New Zealand and Australia. This idea of kind of manufacturing wilderness, this kind of idealized landscape, evicting people and protecting force, was part of not only kind of the British imperial project, but other kind of imperial projects as well. You saw these kind of narratives accelerate during the colonization of Africa, kind of common refrains of Edenic Africa or uncertain Africa served as kind of justifications to evict people from these lands. And it had a very specific kind of ideological framing of nature. So after kind of colonization slowed down, these big international conservation organizations that are familiar to all of us probably, like WWF and Conservation International, the Nature Conservancy, started to kind of fill in with funding and expertise and management of these parks. And you see over the past century, this kind of mass proliferation of protected areas, terrestrial protected areas in the world. About half the land selected for conservation by protected areas during the last century was either occupied or regularly used by indigenous people, just to give you an idea of kind of the presence of people on these lands. So you can kind of think of this model of conservation as we can call it the protectionist paradigm. People call it kind of the fortress model of conservation. And it's been the hegemonic model of conservation for a very long time. Views, again, preservation as a moral imperative, using these ideas of pristine nature and wilderness as justification to move people out. It, ironically, despite calling it pristine nature, relies on evictions, denying access of local people to access natural resources, and marginalizing them in the procedures of that management to develop these parks. So we see in the 1970s and 80s this kind of response to this model and its recognition that that we need to kind of promote socioeconomic benefits to local people, or at least try to limit the impact on them. So there's no kind of unified approach or practice of kind of this, what we could call people-oriented conservation, and it can lie on, you can think of it as lying on a spectrum of involvement. But yeah, it's this recognition of not only integrating conservation or integrating development concerns, but also recognizing that kind of marginalizing indigenous people or evicting them from their native lands is kind of a human rights issue. And it integrates participation as kind of a key element of this. There's different models, UN integrated conservation and development model, or community-led conservation. Again, there's not really any consistent model, but it varies across that spectrum. All right, so that kind of criticism of this model emerged, not only the criticism, but also kind of what guides my study here in Georgia, emerged from this field called political ecology. Political ecologists, they analyze environmental and ecological conditions as the product of political and social processes. They understand that conservation is not, that you can't discount kind of the social context from which, or that conservation is trying to implement protected areas into. And then not only that, but kind of understandings of nature are political. It has a very local focus, so it comes out of geography and anthropology, and it has this local focus, but also aware of the fact that local circumstances can be affected by broader scales. Integral to that, and also my study, is that you need to integrate access rights into protected area policy, that kind of the rights and freedoms strongly correlate to equitable development around protected areas. And so in order to kind of adequately integrate the concerns of local people, you have to integrate access to natural resources for local people. So yeah, political ecology is focused on environmental struggle and conflict and injustice and kind of the unequal distribution of ecological benefits. All right, so has anyone here been to Georgia before? I remember when I got this grant to go to Georgia, a lot of my American friends were excited because they thought that I was coming back closer to home. But the Republic of Georgia is south of Russia. It's in the Southern Caucasus, so it's south of the Caucasus Mountains, but north of Turkey, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. It has a really interesting history and always has. It's kind of at the intersection of East and West, and it's always been in the shadow of these big empires like the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Persian Empire. And so when Georgia finally gained independence, there's this kind of fierce pride in that independence and skepticism of foreign influence. It's on the Silk Road, so you can see the kind of imprints of those different influences on Georgian culture in a really interesting way. So it was part of the Soviet Union for almost 70 years. It was heavily industrialized during that time, but also highly popular amongst the Russian aristocracy, popular amongst Russian writers like Tolstoy, and was particularly favored during Stalin's rule because Joseph Stalin was Georgian. It gained independence in 1991, and it was kind of an important period in Georgia's modern history. They experienced this string of conflicts. There was two separatist regions called Abkhazia and South Ossetia. You might have heard Georgia in the news in 2008 when one of these, when Russia invaded Georgia for 5 days. But during this period, there was kind of a unregulated resource use, logging and poaching, and really just a lack of kind of stable institutions to monitor resource use throughout Georgia. The inflection point in modern Georgian history was the Rose Revolution when Mikhail Saakashvili came to power. He sought to westernize Georgia and align Georgia's interests finally with the West rather than the kind of Georgian patriarch of Russia that had been the case for so long. I remember driving into Tbilisi when I first got there and seeing this sign, and I was surprised, to say the least, to see George Bush Street in Tbilisi. But during Saakashvili's reign, and during that kind of the reign of Saakashvili, there was this response to that transition period to try to integrate concerns for the natural environment more. Again, it was perceived as this period of kind of unregulated, unrestrained resource use. And so they through signing kind of different conventions like the Convention on Biological Diversity and the ratification of the UN Convention on Climate Change, you started to see that kind of slow transition towards a more kind of environmentally focused Georgia. During that same time, there was a growth of the protected area network in Georgia. So in 1989, 2 years before Georgia gained independence from the Soviet Union, protected areas covered about 2.4% of the country. And today they cover almost 10.3%. And so there was this rapid increase in the coverage of the protected areas. And then also increased popularity of them, which you see down in the news snapshot there. Almost 1 million guests visited Georgia's protected areas in 2017. A lot of this growth was fueled by foreign donors, by WWF, the World Bank, USAID, Conservation International, typical to a lot of kind of developing countries, that funding was needed to develop these protected areas. All right, so the focus of my study in Georgia was Borjomi-Kharagauli National Park. It was established in 1995 during this kind of first recognition of that resource use, but wasn't really inaugurated until 2001 when they finally got funding from KfW, which is the German development bank, to enforce the rules of the park. Between 1995 and 2001, it was pretty much just a paper park, meaning it wasn't, there were borders around it, but they weren't being effectively enforced. Before that, this park was a hunting ground for Russian aristocracy, but again, it wasn't really heavily guarded, except in very limited areas. Today, it's one of Europe's largest protected areas, covering more than 1.5% of Georgia's territory. And it's notable in Georgia because it's part of the lower Caucasus, so it's not the kind of high montane environments of the border between Russia and Georgia, but kind of lower mountains. And because of that, you see a lot of biodiversity and unique ecology in the park. There's 11 endemic species of mammals, 13 species on the red list, and relic forest, old growth forest within the park. And it's identified frequently on different categories of threatened habitats that are highly important for global diversity. So the IUCN's biodiversity hotspots, it appears on those lists. So it's a kind of the pride of Georgian conservation, one of the first parks that was developed there. It's in the center of the country. It's big. You can see Borjomi there on the southeast portion of the park. And my study was along that southern boundary of the park. What I intended to do in Georgia was actually different than what I ended up doing. I went to Georgia to study poaching originally. I was interested in kind of illicit hunting of animals in the park. And I remember this meeting, I went in to meet the director of the park, and he asked me what I was going to do. And I was asking him for permission, and I gave him this long pitch, and he just belly laughed for 15 seconds about how ludicrous it was that I could think I could go find these hunters who were trying to be stealthy in their practices, and thinking me as someone in my 20s who couldn't speak the language, not from the country, could come there and find these folks. So what I ended up studying was Fuelwood at his recommendation, because he recognized the fact that Fuelwood was a flashpoint of conflict between the park and local people. So my first research question was just to understand dependency on Fuelwood by local people. Secondly, I want to understand what factors were affecting the ability of these villagers to access Fuelwood. Third, what role the park held in mediating access to Fuelwood. And fourth, do conflicts exist between local people and the park? If so, what are the nature and extent of those conflicts? So kind of using Fuelwood as kind of a litmus test to understand broader conflict around the park. So I took like kind of a grounded approach. Again, I didn't understand really anything about the circumstances there. So as I kind of progressed through these interviews, I was beginning to understand the situation and would be able to ask more kind of direct or relevant questions as I went. I studied 7 villages along the southern boundary of the park: Kabashevi, Dviri, Chitashevi, Akali Ubani, Kvibisi, Banashevi, and Akaldaba. They're all quite small villages, except for Akaldaba, sitting there right kind of at the border between the park and outside of it. I did 55 semi-structured interviews with local people, park staff, and government officials. These ranged anywhere from 20 minutes to 5 hours. And this is kind of a typical scenario where I sat down with some folks and ate with them, and it lasted a very long time sometimes. But it kind of approached that ethnographic kind of approach in some of these interviews. I also was able to sit in on some meetings between park staff and local people, as well as meetings between a Georgian NGO called Georgian Environmental Outlook, who was doing a study of conflict of all protected areas in Georgia. So getting to sit in those meetings gave insight into the nature of some of the other conflicts, as well as kind of the degree of hostility between local people in the park. And then lastly, just an analysis of development reports and park documents. So just a little bit about energy. Fuelwood is important not only for heating homes, but also for cooking. And it was widely used. It's widely used everywhere in the world. It's important, however, to understand just kind of thinking about energy more generally, that as income rises, people tend to progress to other kinds of energy. And the same is true as income falls, that people tend to resort to burning trash or burning other kinds of biomass, and then more modern fuels as income rises. So the kind of reliance on fuelwood in this area lends insight into kind of the socioeconomic circumstances in that area. There's a lot of research into kind of the effects or dependence on fuelwood on forest ecology. What's important about this research, especially in this context, and it was outside the scope of my study, but that it's not high degrees of fuelwood use don't necessarily mean there's high levels of ecological damage, but it can be influenced by social and cultural context. So, for instance, in instances of high dependency, low ecological knowledge, and weak institutions, there can frequently be kind of high ecological costs or high ecological damage. But even if high dependency exists and there's high ecological knowledge in strong institutions or social institutions, it doesn't necessarily mean that damage will be high. There is this relationship between dependence and vulnerability, however, that if kind of energy streams are, if populations are highly dependent on a particular resource, and that resource stream is affected, then people become quite vulnerable in situations like that. So I'm going to kind of pair the results of the study and the discussion together and progress through them in tandem. So first, what I found is that there were high levels of dependency on fuelwood in this area and high levels of rural poverty. The park had implemented a buffer zone when they established the park to address these needs, and a lot of the rhetoric coming out of the park was that they were actively trying to address these development needs. They allowed 7 cubic meters of wood or fuel wood to be taken per household per year. As you can see in this table, oftentimes that fell short of the self-reported needs from local people, often by a large margin. And again, there was kind of a widespread subsistence lifestyles and unemployment and widespread poverty in this area. This is kind of reflected in this quote: "If we do not have enough fuel wood, we freeze, so it is important that we get enough wood for the long winter." There were other anecdotes that came out of my research that indicated that families were moving together and moving into the same house so that they could share their share their allocation of fuel wood. "My family is completely dependent on firewood. Gas is too expensive and there are no other options." So the first and kind of most clear finding of my study was there is a strained relationship between local people and the park. It's helpful to use this theory of access by Raibo and Peluso, who are two kind of foundational political ecologists, to understand that relationship. They use this idea of kind of control and maintenance, where there's kind of one institution who controls access and another who maintains access to the resource through those who control it. So clearly in this instance, the park controlled access to fuel wood, and that access was, or that control was legitimized by the Georgian state. So any breach of law of the park was also a breach of law of Georgian, or a breach of Georgian law. You saw kind of abuses of power. There were anecdotes of abuses of power. One man that I spoke to, his family member had been stripped naked and dumped in the middle of, beaten and dumped in the middle of a city. So that kind of gives you an idea of kind of the degree of hostility between the two parties. There were extreme fines for breaking the rules. But in short, the park had abundant access to capital and technology, forest cameras and gates and park rangers to better control access to Fuelwood. Local people, they had to maintain their access to Fuelwood through, this was through first permits. You had to pay for a permit to access Fuelwood. There was a cumbersome permitting process, not only to get the permit itself, but once you were granted the permit, the park flagged trees, and wherever they flagged trees, it wasn't necessarily accessible by local people. There were often unmaintained roads, and the park wasn't beholden to maintain them. This is an example of a bridge leading into the park that the locals were expected to use to go get Fuelwood. And also short periods. They would flag a tree up, and they would have the local people would have 5 days to go retrieve the Fuelwood. So there's this kind of distinction between the rights that the local people were given to access Fuelwood in the buffer zone, the kind of de jure right to access it, and the kind of reality on the ground. So there's this kind of disparity between the stated objectives of the park and the observed reality for local people, that they weren't able to actually realize that legal right to Fuelwood. Second, there were conflicting symbolic and material perceptions of the forest. So the park itself, in their brochures, they extolled kind of the virtues of this park as a place distinguished by its natural beauty, an important kind of treasure to keep in an untouched state. And similar refrains were made through interviews by the park staff, the WWF staff, and the kind of development by the KfW staff, the German Development Bank. And similarly, they equated natural resource use as being a threat, and kind of inherent in that there was a distrust of local people. So they very much felt that the park should be protected, and that anyone attempting to use resources in the park was kind of a threat to the integral values of the park. Conversely, local people saw the park in a much more utilitarian way. They saw it as a source of livelihood security. It was referred to as a garden, and sometimes they even refer to themselves as stewards of the forest, that without them, perhaps the forest wouldn't be in the condition that it was today. Importantly, these kind of perceptions of the forest, they hold radically different implications when you consider their different and relative positions of power. Again, this goes back to the kind of fundamental ideas of political ecology, that understandings of nature are political. And this is a case in point that these kind of different perceptions of the forest held very different implications considering that power. So the implementation of protected areas carry those kind of ideological understandings in nature. And these are the ones in this park were very typical of kind of Western conservation that views nature as conceptually different than culture, and it was forcefully implemented in this case. This quote again, "What then is the purpose of the forest if for no benefit to the people?" It kind of illustrates that, that idea from local people. Third, competing historical interpretations of Fuelwood use. Again, I mentioned that transition period in Georgia was kind of a turbulent period, and indeed in this case, it was a flashpoint of conflict between local people and the park. Park officials saw this kind of pre-park era as an eco disaster, and not only the transition period itself, but just more generally before the park was established. But the transition period was kind of viewed as an example of extreme overuse when there's no institutions present. Local people saw themselves again as having long used the park. They fondly reminisced on kind of the era preceding the park, saying that they could freely take fuel wood from it. And there's not really, again, it was outside the scope of this research to prove or disprove any of these claims, but each of their claims were kind of justifying, each historical interpretation was justifying whatever actions they were taking. And this was just furthering conflict and furthering kind of the rift between park and people. Interestingly, the park kept on alluded to a study in documents, but I never found that study to exist. So again, that kind of this kind of historical interpretation was kind of amplifying conflict between the two. Again, here's a quote: "The people here have cared for the forest like their own gardens. When there was a fire, the village would help put it out. We know how to manage the forest. We have done so for almost 200 years. Again, kind of pointing to the fact that even prior to the park, they were using this landscape. Another issue, another kind of conflict issue was these tangential influences or non-local sources of power. Again, as I mentioned, a few non-Georgian institutions were involved in the development of the park. These included KfW, the German Development Bank, WWF, and the Caucasus Nature Fund, which is a more kind of regional conservation organization. It was clear that WWF crafted the policy of the park, of BKNP. And beyond that, it's quite difficult to trace kind of the influence of these different groups. We know that a lot of funding came from KfW, but beyond that, it's hard to tell. But what is clear is that locals were very much aware of their influence and lamented the fact that with the vacuum left after the Soviets left, that there was this kind of this foreign influence that came in place of the Soviets. And so it brings to bear kind of questions of ownership and governance and legitimacy, and the lack of agency that local people had in crafting the policy of a park that so clearly affected their livelihoods. There were definitely some interesting quotes about these organizations, some of which I would have to censor if I put in here, but it's that German organization putting animals in front of people is a pretty good example of kind of the perception of local people towards these foreign organizations. So I guess when it came to understanding Borjomi-Kharagauli's approach, the park's approach to conservation, I think it's fair to say that their kind of attempts to fluidly reconcile development and conservation in this context remains problematic. Of course, they have laudable intent, especially considering that when this park was established, there weren't many protected areas in this region, and particularly with their high rates of endemism and biodiversity, it's definitely important. And I'm by no means saying that it's not, but it's important to ask who the park is benefiting and who's kind of losing out in the process of managing the park itself. Again, the area surrounding the park is socioeconomically disadvantaged, and there's pervasive poverty around it and substantial dependency on the natural resources from the park. So when the park kind of comes in with and is able to enforce these laws that affect local livelihoods, you kind of have to ask questions about who that park's benefiting. So just kind of some takeaways. Again, Fuelwood was kind of used as a litmus test to understand the park's broader approach. Importantly, however, the rate of growth of protected areas in Georgia is swift and profound. And so it's important to kind of continue researching this relationship between parks and local people. Protected areas are also kind of proliferating everywhere with these agendas like the 2020 agenda, which calls for more parks, the Half Earth Project, which is E.O. Wilson's kind of goal of conserving half the world. You start to really need to ask about these approaches to conservation that marginalize local people. So any debate about whether approaches to conservation work depends on the frame of reference used. So if your kind of metrics for success in conservation are purely biological or ecological, you're going to fail to recognize the effects on local people. And we see, unfortunately, that these misanthropic models are still kind of integral to conservation. So we see kind of mass evictions in India, particularly, and then also in Botswana. And these are kind of within the past 5 years examples of evictions or abuses at the hands of conservation authorities. Furthermore, in the face of austerity and kind of cutting back government spending on conservation, the role of NGOs will only increase. So it's important to hold those NGOs accountable, despite them not being governmental. There's a lot of cases already that we see kind of the tacit approval of these conservation organizations in park abuses. And this is just one case in Nepal where in WWS documents, they knew that these abuses were taking place and chose not to do anything about it. Lastly, the importance of multidisciplinary approaches. I think there's a lot of kind of lip service to transdisciplinary curriculum in school. Throughout the history of conservation planning has been mostly conservation or mostly natural scientists and then criticized by social scientists. And that led to the kind of the change of culture in the late 1970s. But I think this serves as a very important example of what can go wrong when you don't kind of truly approach these issues from a interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary perspective. All right, I think that's it. I went through that faster than I intended to. I wanted to make a quick plug while I have your eyes and ears of such a group of geographers as yourselves. When I was at Stockholm University, a few of us started this magazine called Niagara Fear, which means geographer in Swedish. The intent of it was to kind of bridge the divide both between faculty and students, but also between the university and the community. And if any of you have been in Boone for long enough, you'll notice there's a rift between locals and the university. And so a few of us faculty here have kind of gotten together and hope to do a similar thing here. And I think that there's kind of ample opportunity in or at Appalachian to make this work. So we're calling it Dog Trot, and Dog Trot is a type of kind of architecture in Appalachia. It's this type of log cabin that has this breezeway in between that serves kind of a functional purpose, but also kind of a social purpose. And so that's kind of the metaphor we're carrying into this magazine of hoping to create a space for really anybody in the university or community to write about things that are related to our region. So this is a first call for submissions. This is the first plug I've done for this magazine. So if you have any questions, just go to our website or send us an email. We have some information on there. It's all very in the early stages, but yeah, we'd love for you all to submit something. Anyway, thank you all so much. Again, that went more quickly than I anticipated, but are there any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen.
Yep, we do have time for questions. So I don't know if people just want to ask or raise their hand, but I'm assuming we can just ask. So just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask questions.
I have a quick question. So is the firewood being used mainly for heating or cooking or the combination of two? I mean, what is the primary use in those communities?
Both. Both uses. Pretty much everyone I interviewed used Fuelwood both for cooking and heating.
Mhm. And then my second follow-up question, how accessible are those, is that buffer zone? I mean, are there logging roads that go in there? Are they having to haul this with, are there draft animals that are used? Or I mean, how is the firewood transported?
Yeah, that's another good question that I probably meant to address. There were logging roads up into the buffer zone, but the park wasn't required to guarantee access to local people. So they were kind of using only. They were trying to manage the forest in a way that was best for the forest without any local consideration for how they were to retrieve these. So oftentimes the trees they would tag were just completely inaccessible for local people. And again, I think that was kind of a tacit strategy on the park's behalf to prevent resource use in the buffer zone, but also a point of frustration for local people because it was, again, it was that kind of gulf between the right that they had to harvest it and their ability to realize that right. Any other questions?
Any other questions?
Yeah, sure. I'll ask another question. You know, I know there's, I mean, you can discuss some of the limitations of protected areas, especially where there are people that depend on resources in those areas. But I've seen some cases, I'm thinking particularly about Bolivia, where, I mean, there's a protected area and, I mean, there's, with the current administration, there's really no enforcement of what goes on in there. And it's being totally trashed by artisanal mining operations. And so, you know, how, I mean, from your experience, I mean, what are there successes in kind of, especially working with mining? How do you, I mean, clearly it's providing economic opportunities for local people, but gosh, at huge environmental costs in these places.
Yeah, especially with kind of widespread use of mercury and small-scale mining and that does to freshwater resources. But I don't have an answer to that. I don't, I think that we're talking about kind of two approaches to conservation, and both have very honorable intents. And it's just, again, it's a matter of kind of your frame of reference used when on how you measure success. And so, again, as far as mining is concerned, I'm not sure, but I guess when you're implementing a conservation strategy that has such high human costs, like at what point you need to calibrate it at some point to make that kind of trade-off between kind of biodiversity or metrics used to measure kind of ecological health and the kind of rights of people nearby to have livelihoods. And so these answers just don't generalize. They have to be highly, highly contextual. And that's one problem with this kind of this approach to conservation that came out of the United States, is you're trying to standardize a model and apply it to radically different contexts. And when you do that, there's going to be conflicts. I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, absolutely. I think it's something that we're continuing to struggle with for sure.
especially with rising populations and more kind of more pressure on these resources, it's only going to become more difficult to answer those questions, and that reflected in a lot of, like in the Congo, where you see militarization of park rangers, and that's one response, is you just hyper militarize and protect by force. But
I have a question about this this study that the park said that they did and that you could not find any evidence of. Can you clarify, because maybe I missed it, but can you clarify what they claim to have studied?
oh, right, they claim to have studies demonstrating the mass deforestation of the forest during the transition period, and that served as a justification to develop the park. But that study just didn't exist. And what was interesting was in different interviews with different officials, park officials, some would say that they did have evidence of it. And this study, I'm using the study, but some people would just say there was evidence of that deforestation, and others would say they didn't have evidence. So I probably couldn't find it because I really don't think it existed. I just think it was them using this idea to justify the park's management.
Yeah, wow, thank you.
Any other questions? No, if not, let's go ahead and thank Anders for the wonderful lecture. Thanks for kicking off the season. And we appreciate your time. And I believe you're joining the department next semester to teach, if that's correct. So we'll be delighted to have you, join us next semester as well. So
Thanks, Kara.
Yeah, thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it. I'm trying to figure out how to clap on here. I'm not very. There we go. All right. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Kara. Thanks everyone for coming.
Take care.
And
Thanks.
Lauren's recorded this too, and so faculty can help share this presentation with their students or for extra credit too, which would be great.
Oh goodness. Can I watch it first? I'm just kidding. Go for it.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, Anders, for giving such a really cool presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia.
Thanks. Take care.